Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium for Tuesday, November 3rd. And we have a completely non-political topic today to take your mind away from what's going on around the country today. And this was deliberate, I think, because we wanted to be able to take our minds off of candidates and politics and political advertising and social media. And I'll introduce our guest in just a minute. But before I do that, I would like to tell you just a little bit about what is coming in next week and future weeks. So first, next week, we are turning the program over to undergraduate students in the University of Idaho Honors Program. And the director, the program administrator, and several of the students in our University Honors Program will be talking about the Honors magazine called The Looking Glass. And we'll learn a little bit about their perspectives on interdisciplinary scholarship and creative activity in that program. And then lest you think that we're going to get out of this semester without a postmortem on today's election, we'll have a panel 2 weeks from today featuring 3 political scientists, Michael Overton, Aman McLeod, and Marky McBrayer, as well as a historian of the 20th century, Becca Schofield. So that's 2 weeks from today. And I think by then we'll have lots of good analysis and commentary and maybe be in a better position to understand what has happened to our country this year and especially with the general election. Today's speaker comes to us from Washington State University. I met Dean Matt Jockers a little more than a year ago at a program sponsored by the U of I and Washington State University called Branches of the Same Tree, Integrating the Arts, Humanities, and Sciences in Higher Education. And this was an opportunity for a dialogue from for faculty and administrators from both sides of the border. And that was the point where I thought, well, we can be a little less Idaho-centric in our selection of speakers for the colloquium. Dean Jockers came to WSU a little more than 2 years ago, 2018. His research draws from expertise in the humanities, the social sciences, and the sciences, which makes him a perfect fit for this program. He uses computers, natural language processing, and machine learning to extract and understand information about cultural trends and linguistic patterns in large collections of texts. And so for today's program, Dean Jockers will describe his use of computational sentiment analysis to study 13,000 novels published from 1800 to the year 2000. And over this 2-year period, we'll learn a little bit more about the ratio of positive to negative terms in fiction and what that says about cultural preferences and about this particular cultural form that we call the novel. So I'm going to close my screen here and welcome Dr. Matthew Jockers from the College of Arts and Sciences at Washington State University.
All right, thank you, Kenton. Let me whip up the screen share here. And I think I do that and then do this. And now you've got my title slide.
We do indeed.
All right, awesome. So this is totally weird doing this on Zoom, and we'll see how it goes. It did just occur to me in your opening comments that the title of my slide here could be a question about today as well. How is this story going to end today? And then it also occurred to me that how the story ends is a bit of a misleading title because this is work that I was doing, I've been doing for a while, but then I got sucked into administrative work. And so this story hasn't actually ended quite yet. It's still, I would say, an active area of research to the extent that a dean gets that pleasure. So look, thanks everybody for zooming in to chat with me about a few books that I've been reading. The opportunity to spend the time with you today is really very special to me. So thank you, Kenton, and my thanks too to those sponsors of the Colloquium series. I've had the opportunity to sit in on 2 of them, and I think I saw some on YouTube as well. So it's a really fun series. So I've been using computers to study text for a long time, since the 1990s. I think that's a long time anyhow, at least in my discipline. And I started working with large collections of books in the sort of mid 2000s, probably. And my first book on the subject I published in 2013, and it was titled Macroanalysis: Digital Methods in Literary History. And it was using an analysis of about 4,000 19th century novels to try and get at things that we weren't able to access through, the typical practice of close reading. And after I wrote that book, a lot of people wrote to me and said, hey, it would be great if you could show us how you did some of that stuff. So I wrote another book called Text Analysis with R for Students of Literature. And R, for those who don't know, is a programming language that was originally developed for statistical analysis, but it's open source, and lots of people, including myself, have developed packages or libraries for expanding what R is capable of. So that book came out through Springer, and about a year and a half ago, Springer called me up and said, hey, would you do a second edition? And so I recruited one of my grad students, and just this year we published a second edition with 3 more chapters and a lot of revisions. I have a third book that I authored with a former graduate student of mine from my days at Stanford, and this one we wrote as a popular book, not as an academic book. And it's a study of where we used computational methods to predict which books are most likely to hit the New York Times bestseller list. And it was called The Bestseller Code, and it came out in 2016. And so the research that I'm going to share with you today involves my use of something called sentiment analysis as a way of processing linguistic data in order to extract the emotional variance, or the affect, as we might say in literary studies, of the material. And some of this research was part of the Bestseller Code. We had 1 chapter in that book that used some of this research. And I don't know that there's an easy way to facilitate asking questions. I guess you could unmute and interrupt me, and please feel free to do that. I more enjoy a style of talk where we can answer questions as they come up, but especially if they're technical questions that will prevent you from understanding something. So, okay, first real slide here is a graphic depicting the composition of my corpus. So in this particular case, I'm working with 13,032 novels spanning 200 years. I actually have a few hundred more novels from the 1700s, but they're kind of spotty in terms, I might have a 5-year gap where I don't have anything. So I've limited it to this set, which is a bit more complete. And as you can see, I've got a lot more material in the very end of the 200-year period. And that's really a result of the work that we did in writing the Bestseller Code. We've compiled a much more contemporary corpus. So to kind of provide a foundation for the methods I'm using in this analysis, we kind of have to understand what sentiment analysis is. And sentiment analysis refers to the use of text mining or text analysis or natural language processing to systematically identify, extract, quantify, and study affect or emotional variance. And the most popular use of this sort of technology is in what they call opinion mining, where, well, like for example, you might do a opinion mining exercise of the front pages of newspapers today on an election day, and you could absorb all that text in and then run it through sentiment analysis, and it might tell you that, for example, certain publications have a very negative outlook on today's election, and others may have a very positive outlook. This technology gets used a lot in industry. So for example, Amazon might use sentiment analysis to study the reviews, the product reviews that people leave in order to understand if people are generally positive about a product or negative about a product. Well, I'm not especially interested in using this technology for opinion mining, but I discovered some years back that these same methods could be repurposed in order to study what's going on in fiction. But to do this, I had to develop a different dictionary. So I won't go into too much details here, but there's a variety of ways you can do sentiment analysis. The simplest one is sort of a dictionary-based lookup, where you build a dictionary of terms and you assign each of those terms a variance between, say, -1 and +1. So the word great might be, positive 0.5 or something like that. So when I was still at Nebraska, I had a lab and I had my students working for 2 years reading fiction and coding the sentences in all these books. And I can't remember how many, but it was in the tens of thousands of sentences. And each sentence was read by 3 different students and so on and so forth. And then from that, we harvested out a sentiment dictionary that, instead of being based on product reviews, was based on actual fiction. So when you take this tool and you run it over the 3,258,000,000 words in this corpus of 13,000 novels, and you score every single word with a variance score based on that dictionary, and then group all of the novels from a given year and take the mean of all of the variances in that year, you get this graphic. So on the y-axis is the mean sentiment of words in novels in that given year, and the year is on the x-axis. Now, this is a little bit nuanced, because of those 3,258,000,000 words, most of them have a neutral variance. So words like the and of don't carry affect. And then there's some other complications, like some words can be positive, negative, or neutral. And so, for example, the word hot dogs, hot sauce, we would probably say these are neutral uses of the term hot. But the word hot is arguably negative in the sentence, "Oh my God, it's hot in here." And we'd probably all agree that, wow, that Corvette is hot, is a positive use of the term hot. So there's all kinds of ways that you can deal with these problems from a machine learning perspective, and none of them are perfect. So in the software that I've developed, instead of actually grading every single word, I grade the variance of sentences. And that's another more complicated topic that we can save for later. But just know that the software that I'm using here looks at every sentence and decides what its emotional variance is. So that's the basis for this graphic. It's actually, I said early on words because it was easier to talk about it that way, but it's really looking at all the sentences in a given year. And the title on the image here shows us what the correlation coefficient is. And that's a very high negative correlation coefficient. And what that tells us is that there's a statistically significant relationship between the passage of time and this overall trend in the decline of sentiment. So we look at this and we say, wow, between 1800 and 2000, novels are getting more negative. So I'm not going to say that's a final conclusion right now, but that's what we would maybe suggest this slide is saying. So naturally, I wondered why it was that sentiment was declining over this 200-year period and how it was declining. And so this led me to some deeper explorations. So historically, we've often thought about plots and novels in sort of a 3-act kind of structure: beginning, middle, and end. So I thought, all right, what if we take all 13,000 novels and divide them up into the first third, the second third, and the final third. And so here, the blue line is the average sentiment in the first third of all of the novels in a given year. And the green line is the average sentiment in the second third, in the middle. And the red line is the average sentiment in the last third. And so here again, we see the overall decline in sentiment that we saw in the previous slide, but also visible here is an incredible consistency in the way that the novels deploy emotional language, which is to say, with very few exceptions, middles are consistently more negative than beginnings, and ends are consistently more negative than middles. So I thought this was pretty darn fascinating, and certainly not what I was expecting, because it suggests that there's some sort of internal consistency to the structure of fiction. And again, remember that we're here at the macro scale, and if we went down and picked any single novel out of this, we might find something different going on. So this is sort of a analysis of central tendencies, but the tendency is that novels are getting over the course of narrative time, you start out with a novel that tends to be positive, and then it moves to the middle, which is more negative, and then to the end, which is still more negative. In general, novels seem to be beginning well and ending poorly. And the high correlation coefficients, those R values shown at the top, demonstrate that beginnings and middles, beginnings and ends, and middles and ends these relationships are also highly correlated. In other words, the behavior does not seem to be the result of chance, but somehow seems to be inherently baked into the form. So overall, there is this trend towards darker and darker novels. And overall, there is what we just saw in that last slide, but there is an anomaly, and I've highlighted it here. What's going on in and around the turn of the 20th century? And so I want to zoom in on that. For a brief period from 1895 to 1922, the endings of novels become more positive than the middles. And this was a surprise to me because I actually, in graduate school, focused a lot of my attention on specifically this period of the turn of the century, and that's not what I would have expected. We usually think of the modern period as a darker kind of period. And what we're seeing here is novels that have if you can think about it, a U-shaped pattern where things are good at the beginning, they get bad in the middle, and then they get good again. And this was a shape that the novelist Kurt Vonnegut referred to as the man in hole plot. Guy gets into trouble, and then he gets out of trouble. So this seems to be a hallmark of the classical sort of modern period. Well, I began to probe this further, and I got concerned that, well, maybe there's something about the composition of my particular corpus that is creating some of these, leading to some of these observations and artifacts. So this plot shows the red line is that declining sentiment, and the blue bar graph is the number of books in my corpus. And one of the things that seems to be happening here is that the variation in the sentiments from year to year seems to be homogenizing, right? The amount of squiggliness in that red line is getting less and less. And so it does also seem like that might be an artifact of the number of books in the corpus. So I wanted to also then look at the standard deviation. And so here, the red line is not the mean sentiment in a year, but the amount of variation in the year in standard deviation. And so this plot suggests to me that indeed novels seem to be homogenizing. There seems to be less variance as we get closer and closer to the current period. So still in my own mind anyhow, verdict not completely settled here. But it does seem to be that this homogenization is not simply an artifact of the distribution of books, because we see it happening in, for example, the late, just before the turn of the century. In that little period, there's a slight decrease in the amount of variance. And then there's more variance in that period of the modern period, which maybe calls some question to the previous discussion. Okay, So since I did some work on bestsellers, everybody always wants to ask, well, what's going on with the bestsellers? So I threw this plot in. So for our work on bestsellers, we had 512 novels that had hit the New York Times bestseller list and stayed on the list for at least 10 weeks. And what's shown here then is there's this one outlier from 1965. I can't quite remember. I think I just happened to know that that book was a bestseller, so I coded it as bestseller, but really it's everything after 1980 that was in our research. Generally speaking, the bestsellers tend to be above or at the trend. So they tend to be a little bit more positive than what's going on in the larger corpus. There are 4 years when the bestseller mean is below the non-bestseller mean. And there are 13 years where bestsellers are at or above the central trend. Now, this is a little bit misleading because not every one of those blue dots before 1980 is a non-bestseller. So there are bestsellers among those blue dots before 1980. I just don't know which ones. We haven't done the work of coding them. But then, and I want to now sort of transition and critique everything that I've said so far, which is that all we're looking at right now is the mean overall sentiment in a year's worth of novels. And even if we were looking just at the mean sentiment of a given novel, that's a pretty impoverished way of thinking about the emotional impact of that particular text. So just conclude part one here with 2 observations. Yes, the ratio of positive to negative words over this 200-year period is declining. Fewer positive words, more negative words over the course of time. And the novels seem to be homogenizing or, coming around to a general sort of sense of what the sentiment in the novel should look like.
Matt,
more
this would be a good place to pause. We have a question from Professor Rob Casely from the U of I Theater Department. Rob, if you want to go ahead and turn your camera on and you can ask that question directly.
Yeah. Hi, Matthew. Thank you so much. Hey. I find this wildly interesting. I'm a playwright. Usually when I attend these fora, I leave them feeling dumber than I was because I don't understand all the scientific stuff. But this really piques my interest as a playwright. I'm wondering how the notion of sentiment, whether positive or negative, relates to how the shifting point of view over time of both the writer and of the reader vis-a-vis things like the decline in faith of religion and the reliance on science and technology as we move through time.
These are great questions, and there's a can of worms that we can open, but we would need another hour, I think. But one of the directions I took this research was we got grant funding and actually did an fMRI study where we studied the way the brain responds to reading different types of sentences, so that we could try and get a sense of whether the sentiment analysis of the text, because what you're talking about is like shifting points of view and things like that, right? Is the tool that I've developed for extracting the sentiment nuanced enough to pick up the changes in emotion that the reader of the work experiences? The answer to that is I don't know, because we had enough funding to study 20 subjects, and that wasn't enough data to reach a real conclusive argument. So what I think, I'm kind of reading into your question because I think I know where you're going. The short answer to the shifting perspectives and so on is that at the scale that I'm looking at, even when I'm looking at a single novel, those kinds of shifts get washed out. They're too small, and I'm looking at the larger trends. Is that at all where you were going?
Well, I mean, I'm fascinated in whichever direction the conversation goes. Because I'm wondering if obviously over time, you know, could one make the argument that novelists are writing more negative novels or is the audience becoming more realistic in how we view the travails of the main character? You know, as we go from writing exclusively about aristocratic characters to more characters of bourgeois or middle class concerns, and now the heroic figure is someone we identify with, whereas before
Gotcha.
it may have been an exalted figure, you know.
Yeah, I think that there is a story in this data that may go down one of those roads, right? I think one of the things we'll see in one of the slides coming up is that after that, maybe it's one of the ones I already showed actually, but after that period, that anomalous period between 1895 and 1923, there's a real shift towards darker novels, and one has to wonder if that's not a reaction to World War I, right?
Yeah,
So, any other questions? So I think
you
could continue with your presentation.
All right, we'll go on and hopefully we'll have a little more time at the end. Okay, so part two. As I said, average sentiment is a pretty poor proxy for understanding what's actually happening. So you can imagine, for example, a book that is very positive, and then in the last chapter, there's an apocalyptic tragedy, everybody dies. And so the experience you have as a reader is probably more about what happened at the end of that book than what happened through most of it. But if you just take the mean sentiment, it's going to be overall positive. So the more interesting part of this story is, I think, found in the actual shapes of the stories themselves. And a long time ago, when Kurt Vonnegut was still a student at the University of Chicago, he proposed writing a master's thesis on what he talked about as the shape of stories. This is a graphic, and I'm sorry, I forgot to put the credit for this graphic that a designer did to visualize what Vonnegut was talking about. And so the main graphic in the upper left-hand corner, that is a plot showing on the x-axis narrative time, and on the y-axis you see the smiley face and the frowny face, the emotional variance. And so this is a story where things start out neutral and then get really good, and then midway through the book everything goes to hell, but at the very end, normalcy is returned, and the book ends in neutral territory. And so if you haven't, you should Google sometime Vonnegut Shape of Stories and watch this fabulous YouTube video of him lecturing about this. And he's quite a character. It's funny video. And so I had just been looking at using sentiment to study this sort of mean variance. I was interested in whether novels were generally getting happier, sadder, more negative. And then I bumped into Vonnegut and this whole idea of the shape of stories. And that set me off on a course of developing a software package called Sujette. And this is just a snapshot of the CRAN repository where you can download the package. For those who don't recognize that word Sujette, it comes from the Russian formalist Vladimir Propp, who talked about plot as having two primary elements, the fabula and the sujet. And the fabula were the individual elements of the story, and the sujet were the organization of those elements over narrative time. So you might have flashbacks and so on to different events. So the events, organization of those events is the sujet. And so I named my software Sujette in honor of Propp's idea. And that image map over there is a graphic produced by the Sujette software. And it looks at, on the x-axis, beginning to end of the novel, and on the y-axis, the sentiment at that particular point. So if you've read Madame Bovary, you know what this story is about. It doesn't end well, right? So developed a program to look at now, where previous all the slides on the x-axis was 200 years of history. Now we've got the beginnings to the ends of novels. And if we take all 13,000 novels and do this, calculate the shape of all of those stories, and then crunch them all up into one average shape, this is the uber shape of those 13,000 novels. They do indeed, as we saw with the beginning, middle, and end analysis, move from a place of positive to negative. But then what was missing from the analysis I did earlier was this dogleg tick up towards positive territory at the end. Right about the 90% mark, something happens in novels. The three different lines here just represent different smoothing methods, and I'm not going to get into that because it's a whole nother sort of dimension of work that I've done. But we're going to be looking just at the rolling mean, which is the black line in the slides that follow from here, because the rolling mean is the easiest to understand. DCT is a discrete cosine transform, and LOS is another smoothing method. But moving averages are pretty easy to understand. So I said that this shape represents all 13,000 novels averaged. Well, the other thing I can do is I can use machine clustering to take all the shapes and pair them up with their most similar, pair the novels up with their most similar shaped friends, right? So you can imagine if we had, if you've read Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, you know that it's a man in whole shape. Stephen has a terrible crisis in the middle of the novel, but then at the end, he has a vision of this beautiful bird woman who gives him meaning to his art and all this, right? And so in this corpus, Portrait of the Artist is going to be matched up with other novels that have this man in whole shape. And if we run that clustering algorithm, this is all 13,000 novels represented in a tree dendrogram. You can see that there are two main branches of this tree. And so I can take all the novels that are in each of those branches and I can calculate the mean shape of each of those clusters. And so here are the two cluster shapes. And this one was really fascinating because anyone who studied literature will recognize that in some sort of abstract way, these represent comedy and tragedy, right? The blue line takes a character and moves him from a place of prominence down into negative territory. And the other one introduces, starts things out good, introduces a conflict and then resolves it at the end. And it breaks down almost 50-50 in this case. Well, we can break that cluster down even further. If you look here, there's actually two subclusters within each of the main clusters. And so we can plot the novels inside of those clusters and we get these four shapes. 49% of the novels are still in the negative territory. This is the orange and the blue lines. They end in negative territory. 3 of the 4 shapes dip negative before a considerable positive uptick. So that's the red, black, and blue. And then the orange shape, which is the truly sort of tragic one where things go from good to bad, is the smallest. There's 1,828 novels. And it's probably not a very fun story to read, which makes me wonder if that's why we only have 1,800 of those instead of more, right? We can break it down even further. This one gets to be a little bit like spaghetti though, but I'll just summarize it. 31% of the books now end above the green neutral line in positive territory. 46% have that clear positive uptick at around the 90% mark. And 70% though are still ending in negative territory. So even though they have a positive uptick, they don't get above neutral at the end. We can look at this same progression over time and see, all right, what's happening to the way that readers experience novels decade by decade. And so starting at 1800, you can see that the ends take us above neutral. And then in 1820, things start to go more negative. And then I've circled the 2 real anomalies. That's that weird 20 years around the turn of the century. And then we haven't seen a positive uptick above neutral since 1920. So after the decade of the 1920s, the final scene never really gets above the neutral line. This is just another way of looking at now the first, what's happening at the beginnings, the middles, and the ends. This is over time, though. So when we get to, for example, 1900, the beginnings of novels are less positive than they were at another time. This is the middles, what's happening over time with the middle sections of books. So the middles in the last 30 years or so, from 1870 to 1890, 2000, the middle sections tend to be much more positive than they were in the 1900 period. And then this is where the ends are. So we saw, again, that really positive endings in the turn of the century. And then lately, the endings not so positive, although it does seem like we're on an upward trend here in the last, well, it's now 2020. My data is a little out of date, but in the last part of the 20th century. So a few observations. The mean sentiment in novels we saw declines consistently over time, and there's a very high correlation. So it seems like something, you know, real is going on there. It's not just some random artifact. The use of sentiment in novels seems to be becoming more homogenized over time. That standard deviation chart showed that the range of emotion detected in a given period seems to be growing smaller and smaller, which suggests that perhaps novelists are falling into a sort of, I don't want to call it formulaic, but maybe there's a cultural force at work moving towards similarity. Except for a brief period from 95 to 23, the final thirds of novels are consistently more negative than the beginnings or the middles. But remember that this is really when we're looking at a very macro scale picture of just the final third. We don't get that uptick that we saw in part 2 of the presentation. Very few novels or decades move into truly positive territory. Here's the note about the positive uptick. The majority of novels in the corpus do have this positive turn in emotion at the 90% point. And the majority of novels, there appears to be a movement towards resolution. That's my interpretation of that 90% uptick. So this is the sort of the ending point. I still am curious to figure out my explanation for what's going on in 1895 to 1923. And I'm also curious to, this is really a question to discuss, right? Is that 90% uptick really reflective of maybe not a preference, but even a necessity for novels to have a happy ending? Okay, so turn off the mics and questions.
So Bob Hoffman here in Moscow has a question. Bob, go ahead and with yours.
Hi, thanks for this presentation. I'll preface my question with a meme I saw recently, and it went like this. Russian novel, is there meaning to life? French novel, is there meaning to love? English novel, is there meaning to work? German novel, no. Has there been any study? I mean, I presume your whole corpus here is English language. Do you know of any similar analysis in novels of other languages, or would you have any hypotheses about how they would run?
No, Bob, I love that, the question and the whatever it was that you read there at the beginning. So the Sujet software that I developed, I did in a you know, the first version was English only, but follow-up versions we did add other support for other languages. And I think right now, I actually can't remember exactly. I know it does Spanish. I think we've got German and French in there as well, but I don't know that anyone has done this kind of large scale analysis yet. One of my former grad students, Jennifer Asasi, works in Spanish, and she's done, as far as I know, she's the one who's done the most work using this tool for Spanish.
So we have a little bit of a side conversation in the chat. Julia Ames wondering if this might be applied to Shakespeare's plays, and your colleague Todd Butler responding that it would be interesting how the shift in genre could be managed. Would you want to comment a little bit about applying this methodology to Rob Casely's area, that of playwriting and scripts?
Yeah, so great question. So have used this on plays, but the dictionary at the heart of my software anyhow is not going to be sensitive to Shakespearean English, right? So the tool would work. I don't know, I'd have to run some experiments before I'd say that it would give you reliable results. But one could I mean, the Shakespeare lexicon's not that huge. One could probably create the software that I built allows you to add your own custom dictionary. So if you wanted to code some sentiment words from Shakespeare, you could certainly do that. Drama creates a whole nother sort of problem. And, years ago, I made a decision that I wasn't going to work on poetry or plays because they were computationally more complicated. So plays, of course, it's all dialogue. And so you kind of have to think about, well, what is that doing to the sentiment and affect versus what narrative is doing? So that opens up all kinds of questions, I think.
So John Grimes would like to ask from a psychological perspective, could the drop in effect be driven by the author's enthusiasm falling as the joy of writing becomes the drudgery of finishing the damn thing? The uptick at the end could be resulting from a call from the publisher telling the author to wrap it up, and the author seeing the joy of seeing it completed. Any observations on just the writing process and how that might affect the tone of the novel?
I think that's a great question. I don't have, I love the question, and I don't have an answer, but I do know that people, that authors are using this tool to look at their own writing. And so, they might be able to learn something about whether they're dropping their enthusiasm at a particular point.
Here's a question that perhaps might give an opportunity to connect literature with history, which we in American Studies do all the time. Julia wonders, does the appeal of sentiments possibly depend on what is happening in the world, such as war or prosperity? She writes, I think when people are depressed, they sometimes want literature that confirms their depression. Would it be possible to sort of correlate historical events or war and peace with the sentiment index?
I think the temptation to do that is huge, but I get very nervous about doing that at the same time, right? And that's probably my traditional training kicking me. But, this is why I'm so fascinated by the question of what's going on between 1895 and 1923, right? It would seem to suggest the opposite of what the question was, which is that maybe there's a push to write novels that end on a happier note during a time of great turmoil, right? But one has to ask, well, maybe though the writing of that novel that was published in 1914 actually happened in 1904, and by the time it gets published, it's 1914. So we really don't know those kinds of things, how closely we can pair a novel to the year in which it was published.
We've got about 15 more minutes if there are other questions from the audience. So feel free to either put something in chat or to unmute yourself and ask that question yourself. Rob Casely, back to you.
Yeah, this is really fascinating stuff. I was having a side chat with Julia about Shakespeare, and at Shakespeare festivals around the country now, the popular plays are the romances and the comedies. But we know that Shakespeare's first big box office hit was one of his histories. I can't remember which history it was, but that leads me to believe that given the population at that time, they probably went to the theater to get their history. And history was blowing through the room at all times during Shakespeare's life. And so, again, that's where the point of view of the audience in that case is craving a historical play, whereas our contemporary audiences flock to the theater to see Midsummer Night's Dream and Romeo and Juliet and As You Like It and the lighter, fluffier plays. So that idea of point of view, shifting point of view, is really fascinating to me. And I don't know if that's something that you would, how you account for that in the analysis.
So I think you're talking about the shifting point of view of the audience in a particular historical moment, right? And so this is, if I think about what is it that I'd really like to know about this, the use of sentiment analysis of the text is, to what extent are the readings of the sentiment analysis reflecting the experience of the reader of that text, right? And that was what drove me down the fMRI study, to see if Seujet was saying that a sentence was negative, were the brains also reading it as negative, right? And, I said earlier in the talk that the results were inconclusive because we only had enough money to study 20 people, and 2 of them we had to throw out because they had bad results. So it was really 18. We did find enough data in there to suggest that, generally speaking, that negative sentences inspire a negative brain response. What we didn't do, though, is look at that in the context of reading a whole book. So I could show a subject a single sentence and measure the brain response when they see that sentence. But what I really needed was $10,000 to lay somebody in the fMRI and have them read the whole novel and track, and then I'd have a graph, right? I didn't know at the time, but there's actually another much less expensive tool for doing this. And it uses, you put sensors on the face, and there's something called a corrugator muscle, and that muscle gets tweaked when the emotion in the brain is positive, happy. And then corrugator is the one that's on the eyebrow, and it gets tweaked when it's negative. So the what do you call that when you do that with your brow? This.
Right? Furrow.
Thank you, furrowing the brow. Yeah, and so they have a tool now that can hook it up to your face, and it's very inexpensive. So you could sit people down and have them read while they're hooked up to this. And I can't remember the technical name for it. But then you'd actually have a graph of the emotional response, and you could pair that up with the sentiment analysis tool and really see if there's a good, strong correlation.
We've got a couple of good questions in the chat. First, from Professor Scott Slovic at the U of I English Department. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Yes, I wrote this out quickly in the chat, but let me quickly summarize. I work in the field of ecological literary studies, or eco-criticism, and there's a trend in my field that we call empirical eco-criticism, which is rapidly growing right now, where people do studies of audiences and their responses to texts. But I recently wrote an article with a colleague in communications at the University of Oregon named David Markowitz, who does a lot of corpus linguistic studies of journalism and kind of massive bodies of text that are non-literary. And he and I wrote an article about the journal that I edited for many years in the field of eco-criticism. We took 15 years worth of scholarly articles from this journal and analyzed them using a tool called linguistic inquiry and word count. And,
Luke.
Right, this one, yes. And
LIWC.
LIWC. And we had a lot of data and we made some graphs, but my job was to interpret this data, not just to point out the trends, toward more jargon or less jargon, more concrete or more abstract, but to try to actually give them some kind of contextual meaning within the discipline. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the challenges and the viability of interpreting this data beyond the linguistic patterns. This is a little bit like what Rob was asking you to do. Like, what can we discern in this data about the way audiences might be reacting, or the way authors might be attempting to use language to spur audiences in certain directions. So I attempted to do that in our article, to actually draw broader conclusions about my entire discipline based on 15 years worth of corpus linguistics analysis. But I feel as if I'm treading on thin ice in doing that. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so, the two groups you mentioned, right? Authors and audiences, and I probably avoid both of those, which is to say that I don't like to get into the business of trying to say what I think authors are doing, and I don't want to try and get into the business of saying how audiences are responding. So I think, and not that those are bad things, right? But I think that what I've tried to focus on is what can we observe objectively about what's happening, and then we can perhaps theorize about why that is happening. And that's the fun part, right? The theorizing part. And that's what I do in my first book, in Macroanalysis. I observe a pattern and then offer some, attempt to offer some explanation, but that's always very speculative. And in that sense, much more at home in my home discipline, right? Yeah.
We have a question from Ian, who is wondering, did you do any work on the influence of shifts in dominant genres over time, or genre influence in general?
Awesome question, Ian. And the short answer is no, but not anything systematic, in large part because of the 13,000 novels in that corpus, I only have genre codings for about 3,000 of them. And so I just don't have the genre metadata in order to do that kind of analysis. But it's a really good thing to do. I worked at a startup company some years ago doing book text mining, and we had genre metadata, and it was just rich to look at, for example, differences between thrillers and romance in terms of different metrics. Thanks.
I'm always curious about our presenter's own scholarly journey. Could you talk a little bit about how you got from literary criticism and analysis to this sort of metadata using the computers and language and machine processing?
Sure. So there's kind of a real story. I don't even have to make it up. So as a graduate student in the 1990s, well, I should go back a little bit further than that. I was a literature, I was always interested in literature, but I was also always interested in computing. And I never thought that those two things would find a marriage, right? And then I'm working away in graduate school doing a PhD in literature. And I got fascinated by the different scribal hands in the Beowulf manuscript, and the question of whether the scribes were influencing the style or the language in the sections that were in their hand. And I did this very laborious by hand counting and computation and statistical analysis of the scribal hands in Beowulf. And after I got done turning that paper in for that class, I realized, my God, would have been easy to do this with a computer. And that's where I began my journey of first kind of computationally mining words. And so that was probably around 1995, 96. And the rest is a tale of intertwined statistics, computation, and literary analysis.
Well, you've landed in a good place here on the Palouse, where your college embraces both the Department of English and the Department of Mathematics, and you really have that opportunity to bring those two disciplines together. And we hope that a little bit will spill over here to the University of Idaho, where our math and sciences are in a separate college from our liberal arts and humanities and social sciences. But there, as we saw with that conference a year ago, we've got lots of crossover, and I think that's represented in the audience for this colloquium today. So before we let you go, I'd like to invite everyone in the audience, if you could turn on your camera and either give a virtual round of applause for our speaker, or just a hand up in the Zoom function. It's been terrific to have you with us, and we look forward to having more presentations from our WSU colleagues and collaborators in future semesters. So thanks again.
Thank you all very much. Very nice, Kenton. Thank you.
And I hope that our regular attendees will join us next week for a presentation by our University Honors Program students talking about their work producing an interdisciplinary magazine. If you haven't yet voted in Idaho, you've gotten until 8 o'clock this evening, and you can register in the polling places. And all of you Washington folks probably already have your ballots in the mail. So thanks again for being with us today. Be safe, and we'll see you next week.